Hi everyone, welcome back to another video of middle game strategy, where we look at what we can say is simple pawn structure, but can really cost a game from a grandmaster. Now I think I should try to put out a disclaimer that I'm not trying to impose on my thoughts or worst critics on any of these games that I'm going to present, but rather to share both my subjective and objective impression so that we can always use this kind of pattern in our own game to avoid any unnecessary mistake that could really get us into trouble. And so with that out of the way, let's put our goggles on and deep think for a bit. Every game that is going to be presented in this video will be coming from the US Chess Championship 2021. And the first one goes to the game between Leinier Dominguez and Alexander Lenderman from round 1. In a game where it seems like a preparation, Black has voluntarily moved his queen to the queen side to c8, the knight's on a6, future prospect will be b4 to d5 maybe. We can see that the rook is going to be brought out to d8 to attack down on the d file. White on the other hand has several plans as well, probably bring this rook here on d1, the rook here to c1, just because the queen is here on c file, we just want to line it up so that there will be a potential discovery in the future. Taking on c file will be a bit bad because then you get a knight into the game. This would be slightly preferable options for white. But the move that white plays here is really in tune and following the chess principle, is that when your opponent focuses the attack on one side of the board, you often want to strike on the other side. In this sense, if black is attacking on the queen side, white is attacking on the center, and in this position he plays pawn to e4. Black also has a couple of options continue right here, but the golden key here is to not let the pawn run to d6 over here. Once the pawn runs into the d6 square, or any 6 rank in the matter of fact, those pawns are more often than not more worthy than a piece. And so I'll show you what it means. For example, black can play pawn takes on d4, stop this pawn from marching, and after knight takes, everything is fine. He can play rook to d8, and then let's say after rook to d1, everything is fine. Quite an equal middle game right here. Black can play queen to b7, getting the rook connected. But this is the first round of US Championship, right? Dominguez is playing against a low-rated opponent, and so perhaps doesn't want to go into a simpler liquidation. Instead, in this position, he thought about 30 minutes and come with a move rook to d8. Now what's bad about this move is that it still allows pawn to d5, and after the capture, we see queen to b7 and rook to d1. The problem is that we can't stop this pawn from coming to d6. For example, we would love to play bishop to d6, but then bishop to g5 comes and, it just pins down the knight to the rook. It's not pleasant. You don't want to come back anymore. But then if you play h6, then suddenly we can take on f6. This is a double pawn structure on the king side. With minimum protection, black's gonna come down under fire. Now it turns out in this position, Leinier Dominguez actually mixed up their preparation. He probably should have just played queen to b7 first, as a mean to get the rook connected. And then if d5 still happens, you can take, and what's different about this is that you can play rook to d8 from the a file. And if you still go the same rook a d1, Dominguez can play rook f e8. So as you can see, although this pawn is getting on d5, preparing d6 next move, we have all forces trying to stop it from happening. The bishop and the rook looks at the pawn here on d6, the rook on e8 prepares a discovery attack on the queen on e2. And so it makes it very, very hard for white to actually push to d6 without getting his pieces stepping on each other's toes, for example, right? So for example, the queen has to move to a square like c4, for example, to prepare pawn d6. But everything just flows for black. Black just plays knight to b4, now planning to take the pawn here on d5. And even if the pawn pushes to d6, we can just retreat the bishop back to f8. And with these many pieces looking at this pawn right here on d7, we can make sure that this pawn never promotes. Compared with this position where black plays rook to d8, and it allows d5, and rook to d1. This rook is stuck here in the corner, and quite frankly there's just less reinforcement for black to stop this d5 pawn. For example, if we just continue with the plan of the perfect world and just play knight to b4, then white still avoids this and play pawn to d6, and after bishop to f8, say pawn to a3, and after knight to c6, we can play knight to e4. With the rook on e8 earlier, this knight e4 move wouldn't be possible at all. And to just really showcase you what a rook on d8 and e8 can really do to a position. In the game, black plays pawn to h6, but then for white it's just very easy to push this pawn up to d6. With everybody coming to the center of the board, the queen being traded off, so now we have two rooks looking at the center. Well, look at black's rook over here, not doing too much on the corner, and the other one has some difficulty stopping this pawn. And so yes, this is a very bad position for black, and probably on the verge of losing if white plays correctly. The next few moves ahead, black did not play correctly, and the game ended up in a draw. So fortunately for Dominguez, he didn't lose the first round, but he still comes in under huge fire after pawn to d5 here, due to a poor continuation. Now the next game might be a heartbreaker for Fabiano Caruana fan, but really indeed, his opponent in this round, Naroditsky Daniel, plays a fantastic game even to the end game. Now as you can see, Fabiano Caruana is really crap on the queen side, and so following the principle from the first game, he plays pawn to e5, playing on the other side of the board, right? This move also allows knight to e4, trying to get to knight to d6. Daniel continues in rook to e8, making sure that the pawn is not pushing to e6. And after knight to e4, Daniel plays knight to c4. Very great move, really. This knight stands here, dominates on the queen side and the center as well. It protects the pawn on d6. So following the continuation of the game, if pawn takes d6, he can play knight to d6. Now to be clear, he does not have to play that. He can play rook to c8 just to protect this pawn for a bit. And let's say if knight to e5, as continuing the game, we can play knight to e5. Pawn takes e5 and then rook takes e5. This will be an equal game. This will be stopped by any of the pieces. In fact, you can play bishop to f8, attacking this pawn. This pawn's never getting anywhere. The queen is in front of it, protecting the advancement of the pawn. So this is okay. Instead, chose to play knight to d6, but allowed knight to e5. Now, as you can see, putting pressure on the queen has to leave the position, but the queen is then protecting the c6 pawn in a moment. And so you move it to active square, which is queen to f5, a good move. Idea is you can't really take on c6, can you? Because then knight here is hanging. And then you also can't move this knight because the queen is hanging. So this is really active. The way you can actually kick the queen away is what Fabiano played in the game, which is pawn to g4. An ugly move, but it's really necessary to kick the queen away. Even in the interview, Daniel Naroditsky stated himself that it's better for Fabiano Caruana to actually just play knight to d6. And say after queen to d6, this pawn on c6 still hanging, so he can take it. And a few liquidation later, we could see that White had this move queen to c6, attacking the rook, but most importantly also the b5 pawn. And so let's say rook to a7, we can take on b5. In general, White has one pawn up in the major pieces endgame, but perhaps evaluated the extra b pawn here is useless because the a4 pawn is actually protecting it very nicely. And in general, most major pieces endgame ended up in a draw anyway. If you just up a pawn, maybe that's not enough for you to advance. By the way, rook to b8 from black will actually meet rook to e8. And after the exchange, we could see that you still lose the b5 pawn. So probably viable options for Fabiano Caruana if it went that way, winning a pawn and then try to grind out in the endgame. Instead, he plays knight to c3, trying to push his luck, trying to keep his game complicated still. But because of that, he still hasn't solved whatever the problem that he has on the queen side and the center of the board. Meanwhile, his king side is already pretty weak. Daniel plays rook to c8, just protecting the pawn here on c6, before running about with his plan. And after rook to e2, Daniel plays queen to b3, exchanging off the queen. This move is awesome, not because he's just trying to exchange off the queen in a complicated position, but because after queen takes on b3, we're pawn to b3. Now we have this so-called pawn wedge in White's position. A pawn wedge is a pawn in which is farly advanced into opponent's territory and it's not really protected. It can be a weakness, can be a strength depending on the situation. But in this particular position, when the rook is eyeing down on the c-file, and also with the counterplay with the bishop and the knight, I think this pawn is just going to be a strength. And he proves it by playing pawn to c5 in this position. Just trying to create a pass pawn with the rest of the pawn here on the queen side. And after takes, he plays knight to c4. Idea is to triple attack the knight here. Now the engine suggested pawn to f4, but then after knight takes, rook takes, this pawn is still dead. This position is not easy to defend for one anyway. Instead, Fabiano Caruana plays knight to c4, and after the liquidation on e2, we see pawn takes on c4. This liquidation actually favors black, because now you see that black's the only one having the pass pawn here, ready to run down the board. And even here, the requirement from the engine is to play knight to c3, allowing bishop to c3, and after pawn takes on c3, try to hold this kind of ugly position, but it's not possible for Fabiano to go into this. Instead, plays rook to c1, trying to take the pawn on c4 obviously. But the b pawn falls, and after rook to c4, bishop to a3, we see the b pawn is free and is ready to run down. Fabiano with c6, but even after this position, after bishop to g7, protecting the b2 pawn forever, and tying down the knight on b1 pretty much forever as well, Fabiano tries to pull up his king, but we all know that in this position, there's no way for White to continue, and in this position, we know that Fabiano Caruana resigned. Obviously, the knight is dominated. We have two pawns, and this pawn is going to fall next. The winning plan would be to take the pawn here on g7 and to park his bishop on e5 while trying to get his king to promote one of the pawns to a win. So it's not clear what is wrong here. Perhaps when Naroditsky plays queen to b3, Fabiano Caruana can still play queen to d3, for example, and try to keep things a bit more complex for both sides to go into. Instead, trade off on b3 and give what is so-called as pawn wedge. It makes it very difficult for their side to defend, and one side easy to just figure out a plan to just push the passed pawns. And so this is really the second structure that we can see, the pawn wedge being very important in this game. And to do that, you have to actually have a significant control on one side of the board. Earlier, Naroditsky actually pushed all his pawns on the queen side, but it can also happen on the center and also on the king side. Hopefully a similar position actually springs in your head as well, where Robson actually beats Jeffrey Xiong with the same pawn wedge but on the center of the board on d6. The king is caught, castling right is now prohibited, and there's no specific plans for black's pieces because they're all on the back rank. And so in this case, yes, the pawn wedge is also now as a strength. And so we won't go into that much into the endgame, but let's just go ahead and look at our last game in this video. Now the last game in this video is between Wesley So and Darius Swiercz. This game stems out from Sicilian canal variation, and after the particular bishop to d7, we can take and play pawn to c4 as what Wesley So just did. Knight to c6, we can see pawn to d4. It's a classic variation of Sicilian canal. Now black also has a couple of options as to how the position goes. Knight to d4 becomes one of them. After knight to d4, this seems a bit scary to let the queen in. The other way will be pawn takes on d4, and after knight to d4, we can play e6, we can play g6 to get this bishop on this one diagonal basically and castle on the queen side. Excuse me, the king side. Now Darius did not do any of that against Wesley So. He plays queen to g4. The move that is only tried out basically tens of times. Not very common, as you can see in the database later on. This one I'm not sure what the idea of, because after d5, now Darius plays knight to d4, but after knight to d4 and queen takes d1, again the king does not have to take on d1. Instead, Wesley So plays knight to d1 instead. After pawn takes on d4, we see pawn to f3. Now what Wesley So has gained is this big central pawn that cramps up a lot of black space, impeding black's development a bit. For example, if black plays pawn to e6, we can even play king to e2, king to d3. If bishop to e7, I don't think there's any prospect for the bishop at all sitting on e7. We can play pawn to g4 next, pawn to h4, marching up on the board. And if pawn to g6, the same thing. I think we can still play king to e2, knight to f2, g4, g5, and then h4, h5, king to d3. This pawn is never going to be released, so the bishop is not going to have any prospect at all in the future. Darius plays rook to c8, but I mean, in this position, perhaps an engine might be able to defend. But in this position, because two humans are playing, you must remember that this position will be slightly unpleasant for black to defend because it just lacks space. The pieces doesn't have any ideal squares, let's say, to just develop and have an attack, right? After both sides open a g-file for counterplay, black kind of blunders here with pawn to h4, now allowing the rook to actually just double on the g-file, where it can actually cause an irrecoverable damage on black's king side right here. And so after a few moves, right after white gets into the g-file and also f-file, plus getting all into Imara's pieces into play, Darius Swiercz resigns here, giving Wesley So his first point to win and clinch the US Chess Championship. But all in all, that's the first part of this video. Perhaps there will be a second part going up if you enjoy this post. But in any case, if you like this post, please press the like button. I'll appreciate it a lot. It'll be easy to track which of the video is doing well and which one is not. So it'll be kind of a feedback system for me. But otherwise, if you've gotten to this far in this video, I want to say thank you and see you soon.